Welcome to Troweling Down Biblical Archaeology for the 21st Century. I'm Gary Byers. This is Dr. Stephen Collins. And we're going to talk today about symptom number 5 of Sodom Derangement Syndrome. We encourage you to not only listen, but you can also read this. Dr. Stephen Collins on Substack. There's a lot more information than we can sneak in here now. He said 6 pages,
for each one.
So not much, won't take that long, but there's a lot more stuff. If you're interested, check in and subscribe. That would be great to have you. So number 5, when we finish this up, we're halfway through. We've just addressed a whole bunch of issues that you've really got to work through. And the point is, a lot of folks, when they hear you talk about the historical realities of the biblical story of Sodom, what happened, and of course the destruction, but all the things around the city of Sodom, people sometimes they just go nuts. Just can't believe you would be so stupid as to think that could be history. There's good reason to call it history, because we think it was. So hit us with number 5.
All right, symptom number 5 in treating Sodom Derangement Syndrome. Now, symptom 5 is this: ignorance of or ignoring the chronological implications of Abraham narrative geography in the light of the archaeological record. So we have to pair the archaeology with the story itself, and we need to go with the evidence. We don't care where Sodom winds up. We don't care about anything else other than just what does the data say? What does the evidence show? Speculation doesn't do us much good.
Nope.
Opinions don't do us any good. What are the facts in the text, and what are the facts in the ground? Those are the two things that are the factors that get us into biblical archaeology in the right way. Text and ground. All right. So, how do we treat symptom number 5? Well, we do it with a generous dose of the archaeological stratigraphy of excavated sites and towns mentioned in the Abrahamic narratives. So we've got to understand what the archaeology says, and we've got to get a generous dose of the towns mentioned in the Abrahamic narratives. And when we put those two together, the lights ought to come on.
You know, a lot of folks that have so much criticism of the Bible as history, it's just because they've never really read it. And if you'd actually read it, you'd go, really? Is that in there? I didn't know that. It's in there.
It's in there. So let's look at some of these excavated cities and towns mentioned in the biblical narrative. Now, there's a whole string of them, and these are the main ones we use. Now, if you looked up and down the biblical text, you could identify a few more. But these are the big ones. So let's look at them. Jerusalem. That's a big one. That's Melchizedek's town, right?
Yeah.
Hebron. Now, Abraham himself, the Oaks of Mamre's down at Hebron. Abraham liked to hang out down in that area. Had some buddies down there.
Yep.
And Bethel. Okay, Bethel. Shechem. It's another one. Now, if you go and let's just talk about Hebron. Hebron, 22 miles south of Jerusalem. You go north from Hebron, you hit Jerusalem. You keep going north, up about 12 miles north of that, you get Bethel. And then you go a few miles north of that, you get Shechem. Yeah. And then just before you come out of the highland spine, dropping into the Jezreel Valley, you hit Dothan. Mm-hmm. And then over at Laish, Dan, or Lasha, which is just slightly on the other side, at the headwaters of the Jordan, up there just on the east side of the rift. And then Damascus, which is a little bit further to the east. Yeah. Now, what's interesting about these archaeological sites is this pretty much is the geography of the Abraham narratives. Well, if we look at what we call the archaeological periodization of each one of these sites, that is, when you excavate it, what periods archaeologically are represented at these locations. Now, and each one of these, by the way, is really well known.
Yeah.
They're excavated, they're well studied, and so they reveal something to us. Given that the traditional biblical chronology puts Abraham, the Abraham through Joseph, and let's just lump all of them together, puts that narrative sequence from the IB2, that is from the late 2000s, say 2100, 2000 BC, all the way down to about 1850-ish BC. The problem with this is that none of the towns we just mentioned exist from 2500 BC down to about 1850 BC, or maybe probably 1800.
None of them?
None of them. That's a problem. That's a problem. Now, they did exist before 2500. They all had early Bronze Age sites. They were fortified towns, most of them in the early Bronze Age. But then at the end of the early Bronze Age, climate changed. So many of the sites in the southern Levant, almost all of the major ones, went belly up and ceased to exist, including all the sites I mentioned. That's true of Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethel, Shechem, Dothan, Laish, Dan, and Damascus. They all went belly up after 2500 BC, after the end of the early Bronze Age, and they all stayed without any occupation until around 1850, but really weren't up and running, recognizably up and running until 1800 BC. That's a problem. It's a problem because Abraham's story needs a Jerusalem. It needs a Melchizedek. It needs a Dan, and it certainly needs a Damascus for Genesis 14. So these are necessary parts of the geography of the Abraham narratives, and none of these towns existed prior to 1800 BC. So it's very simple to me. You have to shift your understanding of the placement of Abraham to get him into the period where he belongs, where the narrative can actually play out over the real world geography.
Now, many people do that. That's the place they've always put Abraham. But there are folks who have put him earlier, and so they have to think this through a little bit. To get
and that's the whole point. It's just to process through it, look at the archaeological evidence, and realize that if you put Abraham prior to 1800 BC, none of the towns mentioned in the narrative of Abraham exist. Now, if that's not a problem for you, I got some land here in southern New Mexico we could sell you. But it should be a problem for you. It should be a problem because the narrative, if the narrative is real, then it has to be at the time when the narrative can actually occur as it is written. And that time is post-1800. Now, if you add to this the archaeology of Sodom, Tal el-Hammam, and the cities of the Kikar, and we'll talk about those later, but the cities of the plain, cities of the Kikar, then we can talk about the correct archaeological placement of that. Because we got a lot of radiocarbon dates from the destruction layer of the city of Sodom that happened just before the end of the Middle Bronze II period, which is after 1800, which puts us in the right time frame for Abraham. It comes in around 1700 BC, plus minus about 50 years. So it's exactly in the right time frame for the time of Abraham. And we'd always said, if we could find Sodom, get a good positive identification, get a good set of radiocarbon dates on that destruction layer, we could nail the time of Abraham. Well, we can nail the time of Abraham without that, but with it, it's sort of a slant. You put the whole picture together. All the Abrahamic cities only exist after 1800. Sodom is destroyed around 1700, which tells us that all of this goes together very, very nicely. and I think it's a slam dunk. So, what I'm saying here is you can't ignore the archaeology because the geography is so clear. We know where these towns are located. Most of them, in fact, all of them have been excavated. The occupational history of each one of these sites is well known and documented, and it would be very, very difficult for anybody who wants to take seriously the archaeology and the biblical history not to be able to move this around where it fits. We need to move Abraham to the place where he fits. Now, some people will say, but the old date for Abraham, putting Abraham's birth in the 22nd century BC, way back then, isn't that based on simply adding up the lifespan numbers in the book of Genesis? Mm-hmm. Well, it is. And so, but there are some considerations that you could take. One adjustment is that there's an earlier date for the Exodus than the traditional one of 1446. Talk about this in my book, Let My People Go. And so if you go back to the Septuagint, to 1 Kings 6:1, Masoretic text says, what, 440 years? The Exodus occurred 440 years, 480 years before that. Septuagint says 440. Yeah. Masoretic text says 480. Septuagint says 440. That buys you 40 years right off the bat. But if you take any of those numbers as just approximations, then you could grab a few more years. But you also have to understand that the Israelite sojourn in Egypt from the time of Jacob down to the time of the giving of the law was not 430 years, but only 200 years, or around 200 years. This is what every line of evidence says. So I just bought you over 270 years of time to move the patriarchs down into the proper time frame so that they line up archaeologically with what we know in the Near East.
So the point is that the biblical dates, we believe the biblical terms are right and accurate, but we recognize that our understanding of them might not be as we've always been taught that they might be. And if we think about that a little bit and look at some of the possibilities, it does seem to fit nicely.
Yeah. And there is the theory, and I hold to this, that the numbers, the lifespan numbers in the book of Genesis are base 60, this is more Mesopotamian style, base 60 honorific formulas. And if you want to read about that and get a handle on what we're talking about here, I really recommend Craig Olson's recent book, How Old Was Father Abraham? Published by Trowel Press. You can get that on Amazon. So just read it. It was his doctoral dissertation at Dallas Theological Seminary. Excellent piece of work, and it will help you with how to deal with some of these numbers. But whether you accept his thesis or not, it doesn't matter. There are ways to put the patriarchs in the right time frame after 1800 BC.
And archaeology provides those answers. You know, those cities you mentioned, they've all been excavated carefully and early because everybody knew those cities. They were famous, they were important, and people 100 years ago, you say, where's Shechem? They'd take you right to it. Everybody knew. So they've really done good research. Our colleagues have done really good research over the centuries to know these sites, and that's what we find. And that works.
It does work. So where does that leave us for this symptom? Where it leaves us is that it's perfectly treatable. We just need to go in and look at what exists, compare the text with the ground, and let that help us get Abraham in the right place. Yeah. And then we can go back and begin to understand not just Abraham's time, but Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and that will get us into the Exodus. Because what happens what has happened in the past is that the old traditional way of doing chronology, placing Abraham way back in the 22nd century and all that, well, our liberal colleagues who don't really respect the Bible as history, they looked at that and they went, well, if you put Abraham here and here, well, yeah, look at that. The cities don't even exist and the culture doesn't fit and nothing fits, and therefore these must be fictitious.
Yeah.
And so if you take those early dates, you can't, for Abraham, you can't link up the patriarchal world with Near Eastern history. But boy, if you make that little proper adjustment, get after 1800 BC, everything else in the biblical record lines up perfectly with what we find in the archaeological record.
Well, I'll also suggest that folks might want to get a hold of the Harvest Handbook for Bible Lands, published by Harvest House,
Yes.
and written by you and Dr. Joe Holden of Veritas International University. And you talk about a lot of this stuff, and it's a great handbook for biblical studies. So we talked about a lot of stuff here. Go look at it on Substack. Take it all the time you want. Read it and check it out for yourself. We're glad to have you join us as we wrestle through our own Sodom derangement syndromes. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.